Assalamu alaikum, family, and welcome to another episodes of Islamic FAQ. I'm your host and your girl, Khadija, and today we're addressing a question that many Muslims, especially new converts or reverts, younger generations often ask. This question was asked by a lovely sister, and she wanted to know, do I have to be a part of a madhab? And this is a very profound question that touches the very heart of how we understand the practice of our faith, Islam. So, before we dive into our main discussion, let's first understand what Madhhabs are and their historical development and the context which they emerge. I always think it's important to understand the history of something before you dive into answering the question itself. If you're not a history person and you don't want to hear this part, that's okay. You could skip forward and to the point where I answered the question itself. So, that being said, there are various different mahabs that are within the community, right? And I'm gonna list all of them that I know of, and obviously there might be some more that I didn't mention here, and I'm going to go into the four major ones that people typically talk about or that you might hear about. So the ones that I know of are Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali. I'm probably pronouncing these wrongs, by the way. My Arabic sucks. And then you have the Shia, which is Jafari. So those are the ones that you hear a lot, and we're gonna focus on the top four that people typically talk about. And just, if you're listening to this, make sure that you get your notebooks, make sure you get your blankets, because this is gonna be a pretty long episode. So the first one is the Hanafi Marhab, and this school of thought was found within, I would say, 699 to 767 CE. Um, this was born about 80 years after the Prophet's death, and this Mahab emphasizes rational reasoning and just also like direct textual evidence when direct textual evidence isn't available. So it became the official Mahab of the Ottoman Empire, and it's widely followed by the Turkish, and the Indian subcontinents and parts of the Arab world. And basically during this was during a time when Islamic civilization was expanding rapidly and encountering new situations not directly addressed in the Quran or available in Hadith. And so this approach or this school of thought was a systematic and logical one, often preferring sound reasoning over weak hadiths and narration. So that's what the Hanafi is all about. And you guys could go a little bit deeper. I always recommend that you go and search and find for yourself. The next one we're going to focus on is the Maliki, which was founded in 711 to 795 CE. And this school heavily emphasized on the practice of people of Medina, considering them as living examples of prophetic traditions. And Basically, this is predominantly in the North and West Africa, and basically it gave this school of thought a unique characteristic because he believed that the collective practice of Medina's people represented the authentic prophetic tradition. So that's what they were. This is what the school of thought basically follows. Then you have the Shafi, which is it was found around 767 to 820 CE, and this was studied under Abu Hanafi's students and Imam Maliki himself, and he developed a systematic methodology for Islamic jurisdiction, and establishing clear principles for using the Quran, Sunnah, reasoning, and etc. And this is often called the father of his Islamic jurisdictions or jurisprudence, because he was the first systematically outline how Islamic law should be derived And basically, this is majorly followed in East Africa, South Asia, and a little bit of parts of the Middle East. And then lastly, the Hanbali, which is the most conservative out of the four of them, I would say. This was found around 780 to 855 CE, and this Madhhab places like a really strong emphasis on literal adherence to the Quran and Hadith using minimal reasoning, and basically you can say that right here this they were like basically persecuted for refusing to accept certain theological like positions, and it was basically followed mostly by the Saudis, and their like complementary like Islamic movements influence this school of thoughts. So yeah, now that we know about like what all the different Madhhabs are and like the breakdown of like them, the four biggest ones at least, we need to understand no why there was no Madhhab like during the time of the Prophet, right? So during the time of the Prophet's lifetime, which is 570 to 632 CE, there was no need for a formal school of Islamic thought. Um, the answer to why that is pretty simple. The Prophet himself was present to provide direct guidance. So when companions had questions, they asked the Prophet directly. When new situation arose, divine revelation would often come to address them. Subhanallah, they were really blessed. And the Quran was revealed progressively, and the living example of the Prophet provided immediate clarification for any uncertainties that people might have during that time. Also, the companions didn't need to engage in complex legal reasonings or interpretation. They had a source of guidance right among them. A lot of people might say, and that is why we don't see systematic like legal schools or mahhabs like during the Prophet's era. Um, it was often the Prophet's death as the Muslim community expanded across different cultures and faced new challenges that scholars began to develop systematic approaches to understanding and applying Islamic teachings. So that's the why behind everything, right? So the Mahabs like emerged during the 8th to the 9th century CE, roughly like 100 to 200 years after the Prophet's death. But why did they develop and why did it take so long? Why was it specifically like 100 to 200 years? What were the people doing before those time periods, right? That's what I always like wondered. And so there's a few things that I was looking at here: the practical reality, the scholarly response, and so forth. But for the practical reality, as Islam was spreading from Arabia to Persia, Syria, Egypt, and way beyond, Muslims encountered situations not explicitly addressed in the Quran or available prophetic traditions. So local customs varied, scholars needed systematic mythology to derive rulings. Um, and this is where things start to get like slippery slope, because this is where a lot of like misunderstanding comes in, where people will put their cultural practices and say that it's Islamic, right? So great scholars like the four imams developed different approaches to these challenges, and some emphasizes on rational reasoning while others focus on local practices of Medina, and some insisted on strict adherence to textual sources using the Quran or the Hadith or both. So, that being said, there were three different major views that were happening during this time. There was the traditional scholars who argued that marhabs are essential for maintaining scholarly discipline and preventing chaos in religious interpretation, and they viewed the four imams as brilliant scholars whose methodologies had been tested over centuries that pass. And then you had the reform mind scholars who suggest that while the imams were great scholars, their work was contextual and shouldn't be considered infathomable. and they advocated for direct engagement with primary source, right? Then you had some complementary like voices who argued that marhabs were historically important and may inherent may create division that weren't present in the early Islamic time, which I feel like I side a little bit more with. But I think, it's up to all of us to understand what is important to us. And is it that we want to follow a specific school of thought or not? That being said, what does the Quran say about it, right? We always want to go back to what the Quran says about it. And everything that we do, that's our source of truth. Um, so the Quran's perspective on religious division is very clear, and it actually warns against religious separation or division. So in Quran verse 6, 159, you could go look this up yourself. It says, "Indeed, those who have divided their religion and become sects, you are not with them in anything." So the Quran emphasizes unity, right, among believers and warns against any kind of division that creates a separate religion or separate religious identities, right? Which is so crazy because we've all fallen trap to creating separate religious identities by deciding that we want to follow these different school of thoughts, right? So as our okay, so something that I want to say a quote that I got. So we never read anywhere in the Quran words such as, because a lot of people will talk about, oh well, we need to read the Quran and we need to follow Sunnah, we need to obey the messenger's words, right? But we never read anywhere in the Quran words such as obey God and obey Muhammad, or obey Jesus, or obey Moses, or obey Isaac. The words used are always obey the messenger. This is to emphasize that it is the message. Okay, listen up now, clean your ears. This is to emphasize that the message of God that is to be obeyed and not the personal words or views of the messenger. So the distinction in understanding this is crucial, right? It's all about our perspective and all about our how we understand the Quran when we're reading it, right? So the Quran consistently uses obey the messenger rather than obey Muhammad, emphasizing that our allegiance should be to the divine message of Allah, not to any human personality or interpretation, which a lot of us, I would say, we unfortunately fall short of. May Allah guide us all. And so, with that being said, there was a divine declaration of completion with the Quran, right? The Quran explicitly states in 5 verse 3 that today I have completed your religion for you, perfected my blessings upon you, and approved Islam as the religion for you. So, this verse revealed near the end of the Quran revelation, and it declares the religion is complete. And another verse also like reinforced this same belief in 615, which says, "The word of your Lord has been completed in truth and in justice. There is none to alter his words. He is hearer, the knowledgeable." Okay, so with all of this being said, the remarkable Prophet Muhammad himself instructed his followers as well, right? If we want to look at hadiths, because everybody wants to talk about hadiths. So because we want to talk about hadiths, I'm gonna bring the hadiths to you guys, okay? So in hadith, Sahih Muslim book 42, number 7147, it says, "Do not write anything from me except the Quran. Whoever writes other than that should delete it," which is so ironic because he literally says, "Do not write anything from me except the Quran. Whoever writes other than that should delete it." So the Prophet, peace be upon him, instruction shows that even the Prophet emphasizes the importance, right, of the Quran over his personal sayings or interpretation. they're literally writing down the fact that he said, don't write down anything that I say, right? Like that itself is like the irony of ironies, right? So, when you think about the historical development of the hadiths in literature, it's important to note that the major hadiths collections we rely on today were compiled 200 plus years after the Prophet's death, right? For instance, Allah, I'm really bad at pronouncing names, but Al Bakari, for instance, was born 194 years after Hijrah. This raises questions about the accuracy and the authenticity of these later things that we're going by right now, right? Because this is something that we have to think about. We are looking at, for example, the Bible as something that might not be as accurate because of how long apart some of the books were written, but then we're considering the hadiths, which has, like, similar length. And I know a lot of people are gonna get heated with what I'm saying, and they're gonna be like, astaghfirullah, sister, how could you dare say that? Well, brothers and sisters, astaghfirullah, open your minds and open your hearts. May Allah forgive us for having closed minds and hearts. So, with that being said, why does God allow different interpretations, right? The Quran provides insights into why various interpretations and even fabricated sayings exist today. In 6 112 and also 6 113, it says, I'm going to read both of them for you, and you could go ahead and look for them yourself later. And thus we have made for you every prophet enemies from among the humans and jinns, devils. So they inspired to one another fancy sayings in order to deceive. The following verse explains, this is to let the hearts of those who do not believe in the hereafter listen to it, accept it, and thus commit what they are committing. So this suggests that the existence of different interpretation and even fabricated tradition serves as a test to all believers, allowing people to choose between following the clear guidance of the Quran that Allah has blessed us with versus getting lost in human interpretations, aka like the hadiths, or like what the scholars are saying to us, or just all these other outside noise that isn't the Quran. And yes, call me a Quranist because people like to talk down on Quranists, but baby, I will stand on that. So, that being said, the alternate alternative like approach is to just be Muslim, clear, simple path, right? So, going back to the question of what our original sister asks, our guest basically represents a growing number of Muslims who chose to identify simply as Muslims or as mu'mins, not Shias, not Sunnis, not bound to any specific madhab or school of thought. And this approach is focusing on four huge factors. One, following the Quran as a complete and perfect guide. Two, accepting the Prophet Muhammad as the final messenger without evaluate like eva- what's the word, like basically making him higher, and making his personal opinions to like basically like a divine status. And then three, embracing the unity that Islam originally represented. And then four, avoiding any separation or division that the Quran warns against, right? So, that being said, the Quran describes itself as complete, clear, perfect, fully detailed. So, therefore, we don't need anything else except the Quran, technically speaking, right? So, for those who are following a Madhhab, if you're currently following a Madhhab, I want you to consider these reflections. And I hope that you are listening to this with an open mind and a heart. And I hope that you might look at this a little bit different after asking yourself these questions. In no way am I telling you stop doing what you're doing, it's wrong. In no way am I telling you you're going to go to hell for following this specific school of thought. In no way am I telling you that I am any better than you. All I'm telling you is, I want you to spend the time to reflect on these questions, to ask yourself these questions with true honesty, and go to Allah with it. Because I am not your Lord, Allah is your Lord, so only He can guide you. So, with that being said, if you're currently in a Madhhab, I want you to answer these questions. Are you following it out of genuine conviction or simple traditions? That's the first thing. The second thing is, do you understand the methodology behind your Madhhab rulings? Okay. The third thing is, are you able to distinguish between divine guidance and human interpretation? The fourth thing is, does your Madhhab allegiance create barriers between you and other Muslims? Okay, for that one, think about like there's some Madhabs that would say, oh, if you don't believe this specific school of thought, then those people are not going to make it to heaven, or what those people are saying is completely wrong. Like how is it creating a division? Think about those questions deeply, reflect on them, and go to Allah with them and ask Allah to guide you. That being said, if you're drawn to following the Quran directly, I want you to also ask yourself a few questions. Are you prepared to study the Quran seriously and systematically? That's the first question. The second question is, do you have the Arabic language skills or reliable translation to understand the text? Y'all, this is something that I need to work on. I don't have the capacity to do that right now because I'm working 70 plus hours a week right now. So I don't have the capacity to do that. But may Allah bless me with the opportunity to be able to have the freedom and the time to be able to learn the Arabic language to really truly understand the Quran in its natural states. The third question is, how will you handle complex legal and practical questions? And then the last question for those who are drawn to following the Quran directly is, are you seeking the path out of sincere conviction or merely to avoid scholarly responsibility? Those are the four questions for those who are drawn to the Quran that I want you guys to really meditate on. And then for everyone else, regardless of your approach, I want you both to consider this. What did the earliest Muslim community look like before Madhabs existed? Right? The second one is, how can we maintain Islamic unity while respecting different approaches to understanding our faith? And lastly, what is the ultimate goal for our religious practices, pleasing God or conforming to these different identities? So I'm gonna repeat that one again, that I want both of y'all to answer for whatever like background or school of thought that you believe in, or if you don't believe in a school of thought, I want you to really meditate and think about what is the ultimate goal of our religious practice. Is it to please Allah, or is it to conform to these different identities? Okay. So that was a very long episode, but the questions of whether one must follow a mahab ultimately comes down to how we understand the nature of Islamic guidance and authority, right? The mahab represents human efforts to understand divine guidance and efforts that were sincere and scholarly, but ultimately human, nothing like nonetheless, it was human, right? So the Quran presents itself as complete, clear, sufficient guidance, and the Prophet himself emphasized on following the Quran above all else. So the early Muslim community thrived without these divisions because they were only following the Quran. So for the question that the sister asks, I want you guys to ask yourself some personal reflective questions as well. I know you guys are just like, girl, you just asked me all these questions and now you're giving me more questions. Yes, I am, because we need to grow, and to grow we must understand our own self and why we think the way that we do. That being said, get your notebook and write down these questions and make sure that you think about them honestly and openly. The first question is, what is your primary motivation in religious practice? Is it to follow Allah's guidance as purely as possible? Is it to maintain cultural norms or family traditions? That's the first one. The second question is, how do you um, reconcile with human religious authority with divine sovereignty. So, if you believe God is ultimate authority, how much weight should human interpretations carry? Okay. And then the third question is, what would Islam look like if all divisions disappeared today or tomorrow? Would this strengthen or weaken the faith that you have with Allah right now? And then the fourth question is, are you following a madhab out of knowledge or habits? Have you studied the foundations of your preferred approach, or are you simply following what you were raised with or what you were told was to be correct? And then lastly, how do you distinguish between essential Islamic principles and cultural and historical additions? What criteria are you using to make this distinction? So those are the five questions that I really want you guys to reflect upon this week. And I do want to leave by saying whether you choose to follow a madhab or to embrace a more direct Quranic approach, the most important thing is your sincerity in seeking truth and Allah's presence and pleasure and guidance. Okay, the goal isn't to win debates or to prove others wrong, but instead to find a path that brings us closer to our Creator while maintaining the unity and the brotherhood that Islam originally established. So, for everyone that's listening, remember, during the Prophet's time, Muslims were simply just that, Muslims. They didn't need additional labels or identities. Perhaps there's wisdom in returning to that same simplicity, right? The choice is ultimately yours to make. I'm in no way forcing you to make a choice today or tomorrow. Based on your understanding, it's your choice to make. On your consciousness, it's your choice to make. On your relationship with Allah, it's your choice to make. So make sure that you're not making that choice lightly. Make sure that you are studying the Quran, you're reflecting with Allah, and you're praying for guidance from Allah so that you could choose the path that you believe that will best fulfill your purpose as a Muslim in this life and the next. Bi'idhnillah. So that was a really long episode, but that concludes today's episode of Islamic FAQ. So whether you choose to follow a madhab or embrace a more direct approach of Islamic guidance, the most important thing is that you're sincere in seeking truth in Allah's pleasure. So the original question was, and that was really long, is do I need to be a part of a madhab? And the answer is it depends on you. I can't answer that question for you directly and say yes or no. You have to decide and ask Allah to guide you on what you believe is best. So make sure that you're taking time to reflect on the questions that I gave you today. This will help you to answer if you want to be a part of a madhab or not. And make sure that you're doing your own research, that you're studying, that you're praying for guidance, because in making this important decision about how you'll approach your faith and how you'll approach your understanding of Islam and your relationship with Allah. So, I'm sorry I couldn't answer the question directly, but I hope the questions that I asked you today will guide you to whatever your truth is and whether or not you should or shouldn't follow a madhab. I personally, and this is something that I want to end with, just to give you guys a perspective. I'm not in any way trying to give you this to you know, influence you to believe what I believe. But I personally want to clarify that I don't identify with any specific sect within Islam. My faith is rooted in the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, or all the prophets, honestly, that I get from the Quran. So during the Prophet's time, there was no specific sects, right? There was just believers who followed Islam. And I strive to embrace that same essence of being Muslim and focusing on the core principle and values of my faith without being divided by these different labels that people give themselves. So I'm not Sunni, I'm not Shia, I'm not Hanafi, I'm not any of those things. I'm just Muslim, Alhamdulillah. So that's my perspective and that's my belief. And until next time, may Allah guide us all to the straight path. Assalamu alaikum. Don't forget, like, subscribe, and share this video to anyone that you think might find it useful. Bye.